It had been a long time coming. Marcus had dreamed of opening his own business ever since he was a child, watching his father struggle to make ends meet. When the opportunity finally came, he jumped at it with both feet. The store was a quaint little space in the heart of the neighborhood, a perfect location for his custom clothing line. Marcus had poured everything he had into it, from the hours of research to the blood, sweat, and tears that went into the design and renovations. But as he opened the doors for the first time, excitement quickly gave way to a quiet tension. The neighborhood was quiet, a mix of families and retirees, most of whom had lived there for decades. It wasn't the most diverse area, and Marcus had always been aware that he stood out. But it was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where he could build his dream, connect with a local community, and offer something new. That was until Karen came into the picture. She was a president of the HOA, a position that was supposed to bring balance to the neighborhood. But in reality, it was a platform for her personal vendettas. Karen had been around long enough for everyone to know her overbearing nature. The first time Marcus laid eyes on her, she was standing in front of his shop, arms crossed, eyes scanning the new sign hanging proudly above his door. She gave him a long, assessing look, her expression twisted in a way that made him uncomfortable. It didn't take long for her to start showing up more often, lurking near the entrance, as if she were waiting for him to slip up. At first, Marcus tried to ignore her, focusing on his customers and the vision he had. But Karen didn't let up. Soon after, the first complaint came in. She argued that his store was a nuisance to the neighborhood, that the parking was an issue, and that the noise from his opening event had disturbed the peace. She sent a formal letter to the HOA demanding that he be fined and that his business license be revoked. The absurdity of it was evident to anyone who knew Marcus, but Karen had connections. She had her hands in everything. The HOA board, local politics, and even some business owners around town were in her pocket. She'd been there long enough to make sure people were too afraid to challenge her. It wasn't just business matters Karen was concerned about. It was the fact that a black man had dared to open a business in what she considered her neighborhood. Marcus knew that Karen's interference wasn't about parking or noise. It was about her discomfort with the idea of a black entrepreneur succeeding in a place she considered her domain. And as much as he wanted to ignore her, he couldn't. The HOA was pressuring him, and they had the power to shut him down. The tension in the air was thick as Karen made her intentions clear. She was going to make sure Marcus failed. But Marcus wasn't the type to back down. He knew that this fight wasn't just about his business. It was about sending a message. He wasn't going to let Karen, or anyone like her, have the final say in his story. The battle lines had been drawn. Marcus took a deep breath, ready to fight back, not just for his business, but for the right to be there. The war had just begun. The following weeks felt like a whirlwind. Marcus was accustomed to challenges. He'd faced many in his life, but this one was different. This wasn't just about running a business. It was about surviving in an environment where he was unwanted. Karen's efforts to sabotage him were relentless. It started with constant complaints. Each day seemed to bring a new one. One morning, Marcus received a letter from the HOA demanding that he remove his outdoor display rack because it violated the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. It was a ridiculous complaint. His rack was nothing more than a wooden frame showcasing some of his bestsellers, artfully arranged to catch the eye of passers-by. But Karen didn't see it that way. She claimed it made the area look cluttered and unsightly. The letter was signed by Karen, of course, with a list of rules Marcus had supposedly broken, none of which he'd ever been made aware of when he moved in. He knew he had to take action. Marcus called his lawyer immediately. He wasn't going to let Karen push him around without a fight. His lawyer explained that the HOA was well within their rights to enforce certain community rules, but Marcus didn't have to accept the accusations without challenge. It was time to start fighting back legally. A few days later, Marcus filed an official appeal, stating that the complaints against his business were not only unfounded but also discriminatory. He referenced the lack of clear guidelines provided to new businesses in the neighborhood, as well as the vague, arbitrary nature of Karen's complaints. The lawyer made it clear that the HOA had to show valid proof of any violations, and thus far, all they had were personal grievances dressed up as formal complaints. But even as he prepared for his legal battle, Marcus felt a constant knot in his stomach. The reality of Karen's power in the neighborhood was undeniable. It wasn't just the HOA she controlled. She was a woman who knew how to wield influence. She had deep connections with local businesses, and through her manipulation, she had the ear of the town's mayor who owed her favors. It wasn't just the complaints against his business that kept Marcus awake at night. It was a sense that Karen could destroy him with a few words in the right places. His first major public test came when Karen took it a step further. She organized a town hall meeting, using her influence to paint Marcus as a disruptive force. In a well-rehearsed speech, she rallied neighbors to her cause, accusing him of undermining the peaceful, family-friendly nature of their community. The meeting was packed with people, some genuinely upset, but others just following the crowd, ready to believe whatever Karen told them. Marcus had prepared for this. He didn't speak at first. He sat in the back of the room, watching Karen's theatrics unfold, letting her dig herself deeper into her own lies. He knew he couldn't let her narrative go unchallenged. When the moment was right, he stood up. It was a brief moment, but it changed everything. "I'm not here to start trouble," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to build something positive for the community. If there's a problem with the way I've been running my business, I'll fix it. But don't let anyone tell you that I'm here to disrupt your way of life. I'm here to add to it." The room was silent for a beat, and then murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. The quiet support was enough to make Karen uneasy. She didn't expect him to challenge her so directly, and it rattled her. The night ended with no clear resolution, but it was a first step in Marcus's plan to turn the tide. Karen wasn't going to roll over easily. She was too well established, too determined to hold on to her control. But Marcus had something she didn't, a voice, a vision, and a resolve that came from a deeper place than Karen could ever understand. He wasn't just fighting for his business anymore. He was fighting for the dignity of his community, his family, and everyone who had ever been held back by people like her. The aftermath of the town hall meeting was an uneasy quiet. Marcus knew that he had stirred something within the community. The doubts about Karen's tactics began to spread, but they were still just whispers. The truth hadn't yet taken hold. As much as Marcus had hoped his words would carry weight, he still faced the enormous obstacle of Karen's influence over the HOA and the town itself. It wasn't long before Karen escalated her campaign. She wasn't the type to back down from a fight, especially when she thought she was in the right. The first sign of her retaliation came in the form of a letter from the HOA, this time accusing Marcus of violating zoning laws. The letter claimed that his business, which had been open for less than 3 months, had been operating outside the parameters set by the neighborhood's commercial property rules. The accusation was a thinly veiled attempt to push him out. She knew full well that these zoning issues weren't valid, but hoped the mere threat would force him to give up. But Marcus wasn't ready to throw in the towel. His lawyer immediately began to investigate the zoning laws to prove that Karen's claims were baseless. As expected, they found that the property Marcus was leasing was properly zoned for retail use, and there were no restrictions that could justify the HOA's interference. Yet, even with this victory, the stress of the situation began to weigh heavily on Marcus. Every day felt like a battle against an invisible force. He could feel the tension in the air when he walked down the street, and more than once, he overheard neighbors muttering as he passed. The gossip was spreading, fueled by Karen's lies and her subtle but effective manipulation of the neighborhood's residents. But then, something unexpected happened. A neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Linda who ran a small bookstore down the street, reached out to Marcus. She had watched the drama unfold from the sidelines, too afraid to speak up. But after the town hall meeting, Linda had begun to feel guilty for staying silent. She had been a long-time member of the community, and seeing the way Karen treated Marcus disturbed her. Linda wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks, more and more people began to approach Marcus, offering their support. Some were hesitant at first, fearful of the repercussions of standing up to Karen. But as more people came forward, the weight of Karen's influence began to loosen. The tides were turning. Marcus knew that it was time to escalate his efforts. It wasn't enough to simply fight back against Karen's accusations. He had to expose her for what she truly was, a bully using her power to intimidate and control others. He needed to show the community the truth about Karen's behavior, the lies she spread, and the way she had manipulated the neighborhood for years. With Linda's help, Marcus began gathering evidence. He interviewed people who had been affected by Karen's overreach, business owners who had been fined for arbitrary reasons, residents who had been harassed for minor infractions, and even former members of the HOA board who had quit because of Karen's oppressive tactics. The stories piled up, each one revealing a pattern of abuse and control. It was time to take the fight to a new level. Marcus wasn't just going to defend his business anymore. He was going to bring the truth to light. His next step was a public meeting. He rented the local community hall and invited anyone who wanted to hear the truth about Karen and her reign of terror. He knew the risks. Karen's supporters would likely show up, but Marcus was done playing defense. He had the evidence, the support of his neighbors, and a burning desire to expose Karen's hypocrisy. The night of the meeting arrived, and the hall was packed. Marcus stood at the front, holding a binder filled with evidence of Karen's manipulations. He looked out over the crowd, seeing both familiar faces and strangers, people who had come to hear his side of the story. His heart raced, but he felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever before. This was his moment. Karen showed up, of course, with her usual haughty expression. She sat in the back, arms crossed, glaring at Marcus as he spoke. But this time, it wasn't just her words that would determine the outcome. It was the truth. As Marcus laid out the evidence, presenting the testimonies of those who had suffered under Karen's control, the room grew quiet. People began to shift uncomfortably in their seats as the realization set in. Karen wasn't the hero she had made herself out to be. She was a tyrant who had used her position to manipulate and silence anyone who dared to oppose her. Karen tried to interrupt, but Marcus wouldn't allow it. He calmly continued, outlining how Karen's actions had affected not just him, but the entire neighborhood. The tide was turning, and Karen knew it. Her expression twisted with anger as she realized she was losing control. When Marcus finished, the room erupted into murmurs of agreement and support. For the first time, Karen was no longer the person with all the power. She was the one who was exposed, and the truth was on Marcus's side. The next few days after the community meeting felt surreal. Marcus had delivered the final blow to Karen's carefully constructed image, but he wasn't naive enough to believe that the battle was over. Karen was furious, and her supporters were not going to let this slide without a fight. But Marcus wasn't backing down. He couldn't. He had seen the power of truth, and he wasn't about to let Karen manipulate the narrative any longer. The first sign that things were shifting in Marcus's favor came from the town's local newspaper. A journalist who had attended the meeting reached out to him for an interview. She had been in the audience when Marcus had presented the evidence, and the truth of the situation had made an impact on her. She wanted to write a story about the ordeal, a piece that exposed Karen's abuses and highlighted the resilience of Marcus and the community standing behind him. The article, titled Small Business Owner Takes on HOA Tyrant, The Truth Behind Karen's Reign of Terror, was published a week later. It was an honest, no-nonsense piece that painted Karen as a power-hungry individual who had been using the HOA to manipulate and control her neighbors for far too long. The article quickly went viral, shared across social media, and posted on various local forums. Marcus's story resonated with so many people, those who had suffered under HOA restrictions, those who had faced discrimination, and those who were simply tired of bullies like Karen running unchecked. The backlash against Karen was immediate and intense. The very same neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out began to distance themselves from her. Some who had been reluctant to stand up to her now felt empowered to share their own stories. They spoke out about the unfair fines, the arbitrary rules, and the way Karen had used her power to harass anyone who didn't fall in line. Karen tried to dismiss the article, claiming it was a smear campaign. But the truth had already taken hold. Her supporters were dwindling, and the support for Marcus and his business grew stronger. People who had once sided with her began to shift their loyalties, realizing they had been manipulated. But Karen wasn't one to go down without a fight. In the days that followed, she started retaliating with more subtle tactics, spreading rumors about Marcus's business, trying to dig up dirt on him, and continuing her attempt to turn the community against him. She couldn't let go of her need to control. Then came the final confrontation. Karen filed a lawsuit, accusing Marcus of defamation. She claimed that his public accusations had caused irreparable damage to her reputation, and demanded that he retract his statements or face legal consequences. It was an act of desperation. She had no real case, but she was willing to go to any length to regain her power. Marcus was undeterred. His lawyer, armed with the evidence they had gathered, was confident that they would win. The defamation suit was quickly dismissed, and the judge made it clear that Karen's actions had been damaging, not Marcus's statements. It was the last straw for Karen. Her entire facade crumbled in front of the entire community. The once feared HOA president was now nothing more than a disgraced woman who had been exposed for her manipulation and abuse of power. The support Marcus had earned throughout this battle was unwavering, and the community was finally united in their rejection of Karen's reign of terror. In the days that followed, the changes came quickly. Karen was removed from her position as HOA president, and the board voted to institute reforms that would ensure no one could misuse their power the way she had. The neighborhood began to heal from the wounds she had inflicted over the years. Marcus's business not only survived, it thrived. The support from his neighbors and the local community continued to pour in, and his clothing line became a symbol of resilience and empowerment. People came from all over to shop, not just for the clothes, but to show their solidarity with a man who had stood up to a bully and won. And as for Karen, she was forced to leave the neighborhood. With her reputation in tatters and no more allies, she packed up her things and moved away, her reign of terror finally over. Marcus stood in front of his shop, reflecting on everything he had gone through. He had fought for his business, for his community, and for himself. And in the end, it wasn't just a success that mattered. It was a victory of truth over lies, of courage over fear. As he looked around, seeing his neighbors walking by, some of them stopping to greet him, Marcus couldn't help but smile. The battle had been long, but it had been worth it. He had come to this community to build something positive, and he had done just that. Karen's attempt to block his success had only made him stronger. And now, with the support of the people around him, he was ready to take on whatever challenges came next. The weeks that followed Karen's removal from the HOA presidency were unlike anything Marcus had imagined. The weight of tension that had hung over the neighborhood lifted almost overnight, and a sense of relief began to ripple through the streets. For Marcus, it wasn't just about breathing easier. It was about reclaiming space, opportunity, and dignity. His business, once threatened by baseless complaints and intimidation, now had the freedom to flourish. Word of Marcus's victory spread far beyond the neighborhood. Local news stations picked up his story, broadcasting a narrative that framed him as a symbol of courage in the face of oppression. Social media channels buzzed with support, with residents from other towns and cities applauding his perseverance. He began receiving calls from other small business owners who had faced similar harassment, some looking for advice, others simply sharing their own stories of injustice. Marcus realized that what he had faced was bigger than one neighborhood. It was emblematic of a systemic problem that many overlooked: the abuse of power and influence, and the subtle ways it could be wielded to oppress those who dared to succeed. Marcus decided to channel this momentum into a bigger vision. His shop became more than just a clothing store. It was now a community hub, a place where people could come together, learn, and grow. He started hosting workshops on entrepreneurship, inviting local youth to understand the basics of running a business and overcoming barriers. He partnered with nearby schools to provide mentorship programs and even offered microgrants to aspiring business owners. His story had become a movement, inspiring others to stand up against unjust authority. Meanwhile, Karen's absence left a noticeable void in the neighborhood, but it also left a cautionary tale. Her departure wasn't just physical. The fear and manipulation she had fostered lingered for a while, but it was slowly replaced by collective awareness. The HOA began to implement stricter transparency rules and accountability measures, ensuring that no future president could exert the same oppressive control. Marcus's influence and example had reshaped the neighborhood's power dynamics, creating a safer environment for anyone with a vision. Despite the progress, Marcus remained vigilant. He knew that the scars left by Karen's tactics were not easily erased. Some residents still held on to residual biases, though now they were muted by the visible support he had garnered. Marcus took this as an opportunity to educate, not to confront. He maintained open dialogues with neighbors, ensuring that the community understood that the changes weren't just about him. They were about fairness, respect, and opportunity for everyone. His business continued to grow at an unprecedented rate. The clothing line, once a small venture targeting local clients, now had regional attention. Orders came in from neighboring towns, and local influencers began showcasing his designs online. His success was no longer just a personal achievement. It was proof that resilience and integrity could overcome obstruction, prejudice, and sabotage. Marcus also made a conscious decision to give back to those who had supported him during the struggle. Linda, the bookstore owner who had been one of the first to stand up, received a partnership opportunity with Marcus for collaborative community events. Other neighbors who had lent their voices and support were invited to contribute to workshops and community projects. He knew that none of this would have been possible without solidarity, and he made it a point to ensure that everyone's efforts were recognized. But the real triumph came when the final remnants of Karen's influence were dismantled. The HOA board, now fully aware of the damage she had inflicted, went through all her records. They reversed unfair fines, nullified arbitrary rules she had imposed, and restructured the guidelines of community oversight. Her allies were either forced out or discredited, leaving her isolated from any sphere of influence she had once held. The neighborhood had healed, and Marcus had played a pivotal role in that transformation. The satisfaction of victory, however, wasn't just external. Marcus felt a profound internal shift. The months of stress, anxiety, and confrontation had tested his patience, determination, and moral compass. Emerging from it, he realized that the battle had strengthened him in ways no business achievement alone ever could. He had learned to navigate hostility with strategy, to wield truth with precision, and to maintain his dignity under relentless pressure. Every setback became a lesson, every challenge a stepping stone. As Marcus looked around his thriving shop one evening, the streets bathed in the warm glow of sunset, he saw the subtle transformations. Neighbors smiling, children attending workshops, small business owners exchanging ideas. The neighborhood was no longer just a backdrop for conflict. It was a community that had reclaimed its integrity and inclusivity. And at the center of it all stood Marcus, not as a conqueror, but as a catalyst for change. He knew this wasn't the end of challenges, but it was the end of one very significant chapter. Karen's attempt to sabotage him had backfired spectacularly, creating a ripple effect far beyond what she had ever imagined. Marcus had turned adversity into opportunity, hostility into education, and oppression into empowerment. The stage was now set for a brighter future, not just for his business, but for the entire community. Karen's shadow had finally faded, and Marcus's light was shining brighter than ever. He had reclaimed his space, his reputation, and his dignity, and nothing could take that away. The dust had settled, but there was one final task that Marcus knew he had to complete. It wasn't enough for him to simply win. He had to ensure that the community would never again fall under the control of people like Karen. His ultimate goal wasn't just about his business's survival or his personal success. It was about changing the culture of the neighborhood, about ensuring that the power dynamics that had been manipulated for so long would be dismantled for good. The final blow to Karen came when the legal consequences of her actions were exposed. In a twist of fate, one of Karen's former allies on the HOA board, a woman named Susan, came forward with information that would prove to be the nail in Karen's coffin. Susan, who had been a passive participant in the manipulation but had ultimately distanced herself after Karen's reign of terror, provided evidence of Karen's personal financial dealings with businesses in the area. It turned out that Karen had been using her position to direct business contract to her friends and allies, all while ensuring that Marcus's business, and others, were held back by unnecessary fines and restrictions. The details were staggering. Marcus's lawyer worked tirelessly with local authorities to ensure that Karen faced the full extent of the law for her actions. The case was brought to court, and the press was all over it. What had started as a small personal feud between Marcus and Karen quickly grew into a public spectacle. The media's attention turned to the powerful woman who had used her position for personal gain, manipulating the community for years. As the trial went on, it became clear that Karen's actions weren't just morally wrong. They were illegal. Her abuse of power, her corruption, and her constant efforts to harass Marcus and other residents were all laid bare. The community, who had once feared Karen and her influence, now stood behind Marcus as a hero of the story. Every neighbor who had suffered under her control, every person who had been unjustly fined or harassed, now saw the full scope of her wrongdoing. The final verdict came swiftly. Karen was convicted of multiple counts of fraud, coercion, and abuse of power. Her role in the HOA was officially revoked, and she was banned from ever holding any office in the neighborhood again. The fine she was ordered to pay was hefty, enough to make a significant impact on her financial standing, though Marcus knew that the real loss for her wasn't monetary. It was a complete erosion of her reputation and her influence. Karen had been brought to justice, and there was no coming back from this. But the effects of her downfall were far-reaching. The neighborhood began to shift in ways that Marcus had hoped for all along. Residents who had once been intimidated by Karen's control began to come together, no longer bound by fear. The HOA, under new leadership, began to operate transparently and with accountability. They established clear, fair rules for all businesses in the area, ensuring that everyone had an equal chance to thrive. Marcus's success became a model for how a community could support each other rather than tear each other down. As for Marcus, the final chapter of his fight was not just about winning. It was about changing the narrative. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a symbol of resilience, of fighting for what was right in the face of adversity. His clothing line grew exponentially, and he began to expand into new ventures, using his platform to advocate for other small business owners, especially those from underrepresented communities. The store became a gathering place, not just for shopping but for connection and empowerment. Workshops were held regularly, and Marcus made it a point to bring in experts who could help others learn the ropes of entrepreneurship, from marketing strategies to legal rights. His work wasn't done. He knew that the fight for equality and fairness in business was ongoing, but his success had laid the foundation for a new type of community, one where power was no longer monopolized by a single person and where success was celebrated as a collective effort. As Marcus stood outside his shop one evening, the sunset casting long shadows over the street, he reflected on everything he had been through. The months of uncertainty, the stress of fighting against a system that seemed rigged, the emotional toll of standing up to someone as formidable as Karen. It had all been worth it. He had taken on the bully, and not only had he won, but he had transformed the very fabric of the neighborhood. Karen had thought she could stop him. She had thought that her position, her power, and her prejudice could crush his dreams. But in the end, it was Marcus's determination, his integrity, and the unwavering support of his community that prevailed. He smiled to himself, the weight of his journey settling into a quiet pride. The neighborhood had been changed for the better, and Marcus had proven something far more important than his ability to run a successful business. He had proven that no one, not even the most powerful bully, could stop a determined man who was willing to fight for what was right. And as the doors to his shop swung open, welcoming customers, Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. The end